The second envelope was heavier than the first. Not dramatically heavier, not in a way that would have been noticeable to anyone who was not paying close attention, but to hands that had spent 50 years making precise judgments about the weight and substance of materials, the difference registered clearly. There was more paper inside it, or the paper itself was of a heavier stock, or both. Whatever the explanation, the object in Margaret's hands had a different quality than the one she had just set aside, a different density, a different sense of consequence waiting to be unfolded. She turned it over. The return address was a downtown Cedar Hollow street, a business district, address a building she thought she might have passed 100 times without noting specifically. The handwriting on the envelope was different from Winifred Crane's small, careful script. This was larger, more expansive, the handwriting of someone who had been taught that letters should take up their full allotted space and not apologize for doing so. A man's handwriting, she thought, though she could not have said precisely why she was certain of that. Something in the pressure of it, the confidence of the strokes. The postmark read September 1985, 2 months after the scandal had consumed her life, 2 months after the wedding had been canceled and the town had made its collective judgment, and she and Thomas had stood together at a county courthouse with no one beside them and married each other in 5 minutes with a justice of the peace who had the distracted air of someone running slightly behind on his afternoon schedule. She opened it. Dear Mrs. Ashworth, it began in that large, unhurried script. I am writing to you because I have been told by a mutual acquaintance that you are Margaret Sullivan's grandmother, and because I cannot find any other outlet for what I witnessed this past spring that would not destroy my family's livelihood and my wife's willingness to remain married to me. My name is Franklin Aldous. I am the owner of Aldous Hardware and Building Supply, which has operated on Merchant Street in Cedar Hollow for 22 years. I am not a man given to letter writing or to involving myself in other people's affairs, and I want you to understand that I have spent 4 months trying to find a way to not write this letter, to convince myself that what I saw was ambiguous, that my interpretation of it was incorrect, that there was some reasonable explanation for what I witnessed, that I have simply failed to consider. I have not been able to convince myself of any of those things. In the first week of May 1985, I was working late at my office, finishing the quarterly accounts that had gotten behind due to a supply chain problem with a contractor in Richmond. It was past 9 in the evening when I finally locked up and walked to my car, which I had parked in the lot behind the building rather than on the street. The most direct route to that lot took me through the alley that runs along the back of Merchant Street and then through the edge of the church parking lot where Reverend Sutton's office building is situated. I saw Margaret Sullivan in that parking lot. She was walking quickly toward her car, and Reverend Sutton was following her. I recognized both of them clearly. I had known Sutton for 15 years and Margaret by sight for perhaps 2 years, and the light in that lot was sufficient for identification. I watched him follow her to her car. I watched him position himself between her and the driver's door in a way that was unambiguous in its intent. I was perhaps 40 yards away, too far to hear the conversation clearly, but I could see the body language of both participants with complete clarity. I saw him reach out and take hold of her arm when she tried to move past him. I saw her pull her arm free. I saw him do it again. I saw her push his hand away with a firmness that communicated its own message clearly enough to require no narration. I watched this exchange repeat itself for perhaps 2 minutes before she finally managed to get into her car and drive away quickly. This was several weeks before the story broke publicly. When the story broke and I heard what he had accused her of, I understood immediately what I had witnessed in that parking lot. I understood that what I saw was the behavior of a man who had been pursuing a woman who did not want his attention and had been refused repeatedly and was not accustomed to being refused. I should have come forward, Mrs. Ashworth. I should have walked into the church elders' meeting and told them what I saw and let the consequences come. I know this. I have known it since the day I first heard the accusation and understood what I had seen. But my wife reminded me firmly and at some length that we have significant business with 4 church members who are among our largest accounts. That standing against Gerald Sutton publicly would cost us those accounts and likely others. Besides that, the social cost in a town this size of being the man who called the beloved pastor a liar would be considerable and lasting, that we have 2 children in the Cedar Hollow school system whose experience of the next 10 years would be shaped by how their father chose to handle this moment. She was not wrong. That is the most corrosive part of it. She was not wrong about any of it. The costs she described are real, and I have no standing to dismiss them. I am choosing my family's financial security over an innocent woman's reputation. And I am writing this letter because I need someone to know that I know what I am doing, and I know it is wrong, and I am doing it anyway, and that knowledge is something I will have to find a way to carry for the rest of my life. Margaret Sullivan is innocent of everything she has been accused of. I saw with my own eyes what the actual nature of the interaction between them was. What he accused her of doing, he was doing to her. Precisely and without any ambiguity. I am sorry. I am more sorry than this letter can express. I hope that somehow, in some way I cannot currently envision, this written testimony will eventually matter and will eventually help her, even if that day comes far too late to repair the damage already done. Yours in shame and regret, Franklin Aldous. Margaret read the letter twice. The second reading was slower than the first and more deliberate because the first had been the reading of someone trying to absorb a large quantity of information quickly, and the second was the reading of someone beginning to understand the full shape of what they were holding. She read it with the particular quality of attention she had learned over 50 years of examining fabric, the capacity to look at something closely enough that its underlying structure becomes visible beneath its surface. Two witnesses. Two people who had seen the truth of what happened between her and Gerald Sutton, who had seen it with sufficient clarity and proximity to document it in writing, who had been moved by conscience to put what they knew on paper even while fear prevented them from taking it any further. Two people who had chosen to live with the guilt of silence while she lived with the consequences of a lie. She set Franklin Aldis's letter beside Winifred Crane's on the earthen floor of the basement. Side by side, they made a particular kind of picture. Then she picked up the third envelope. This one had no return address. It was addressed simply in the handwriting she had recognized the moment she saw it, too. My beloved Margaret, and the letters of her name had been written with the particular care that Cornelia Ashworth had always brought to things that mattered to her, the same care she brought to setting a table for company, to tending the roses along her front walk, to holding a child's face in her hands and looking at it as though committing it fully and permanently to memory. Margaret sat for a moment with the envelope in her hands before opening it. The October light through the open basement door had shifted further toward evening, the angle of it flattening and warming the way light does in the last hour before dark, casting long shadows through the trees on the hillside and laying a band of gold across the threshold of the open door that reached just far enough into the basement to touch the edge of the wedding dress spread across Margaret's lap. She opened the envelope. The letter inside was 4 pages written in a hand that started controlled and became progressively less so, the letters growing larger and less precise as the pages accumulated, as though the effort of writing had cost Cornelia something she did not have in unlimited supply. And she had spent it steadily through the pages until what remained at the end was the last reserves of a woman who needed to finish what she had started, regardless of what it required. My dearest Margaret, it began. If you are reading this letter, then I am gone and you have finally come to the sanctuary as I begged you to. I am sorry that it took this long. I am sorry for whatever pain and loss and desperation finally brought you here, because I know you well enough to know that you would not have come unless things had become very difficult indeed. You were always the one in this family who found a way to manage without asking for help, and I tried to teach you that quality, and I succeeded too well, and I am sorry for that too. I have so much to apologize for in this letter, my darling. More than 4 pages can hold. But I will do my best because you deserve to understand what happened and why I made the choices I made, even if understanding them does not excuse them. When the first letter arrived in August of 1985, I was already planning to act. I had known what happened to you, known the broad outlines of it, known that Gerald Sutton had destroyed your wedding and your reputation and your standing in this town, and I had been furious in the way of old women who have lived long enough to recognize a particular kind of evil when they encounter it and are no longer inclined toward the charitable interpretation of ambiguous behavior. When Winifred Crane's letter arrived, and then Franklin Aldis's letter 2 weeks later, I had what I needed. Testimony from witnesses. Documentation. The kind of evidence that could be placed in front of the church elders and demand serious consideration, because however much they trusted Sutton, they could not simply ignore signed written testimony from named individuals who had witnessed specific events. I made appointments with 3 of the elders. I prepared what I intended to say. I assembled the letters carefully and wrote notes on how to present them clearly and effectively. I was Margaret, fully prepared to walk into that building and force them to reckon with what their beloved pastor had done. And then he came to my house. I want you to understand who Gerald Sutton was in this town in 1985. He was not simply a well-liked pastor. He was a man whose influence extended into the financial and social structures of Cedar Hollow in ways that were not always visible but were always operative. He sat on boards. He had relationships with judges and county officials. He had been building his position in this community for 15 years, and he had built it thoroughly with the patience and deliberateness of someone who understood that real power is accumulated slowly and maintained carefully. He came to my house on a Wednesday evening in October, a week before my first scheduled meeting with the elders. I did not know how he knew I had the letters. I still do not know. Perhaps one of the letter writers in a moment of conscience or fear had told someone. Perhaps he had connections I was not aware of. Perhaps he was simply the kind of man who has always maintained enough awareness of his own vulnerabilities to monitor for threats before they become dangerous. He sat in my front room and he told me very clearly what would happen if I brought those letters to the elders. He did not shout. He did not threaten in the manner of someone who has lost control of the situation. He spoke quietly and pleasantly, in the measured tone of a man describing outcomes he has already calculated and found entirely achievable. He said he would spread additional accusations about you worse than what he had already said. He said he would make certain that Thomas lost every carpentry contract he held in Cedar Hollow and the surrounding county. He said he would see to it that your alterations business was finished, that no one in Cedar Hollow would bring you work, that the isolation you were already experiencing would become total and permanent. He described these outcomes with the specificity of someone who had already decided they were the appropriate response and was merely informing me of what had been decided. And Margaret, I believed him. I want you to know that I did not believe him out of naivety or because I did not understand the kind of man he was. I believed him because I had lived in Cedar Hollow for 40 years, and I understood exactly how much of it he controlled and how comprehensively he could make good on everything he described. He had the connections and the influence and the total confidence of a man who has never been successfully challenged by anyone he has decided to oppose. I was 71 years old. You had just been through the worst months of your life, and you were barely beginning to build something survivable with Thomas. I told myself that the right choice was to protect what little you had rather than risk losing it entirely in a fight I was not certain I could win. I have questioned that choice every day since. I have rehearsed 100 alternative decisions. I have imagined 100 versions of that October evening in which I looked at Gerald Sutton sitting in my front room and told him that I was going to use those letters regardless of what he threatened. And I have played forward each of those versions to their probable consequences. And I have never been able to arrive at a version in which you came out of it better than you did. I do not know if that means I made the right choice. I know only that I made the choice I made and that I have carried it and that I am leaving you these letters now because I want you to have what I kept from you, even if the keeping of it was an act I believed at the time was a form of protection. The letters are real. The witnesses are real. Winifred Crane was telling the truth. Franklin Aldous was telling the truth. What they saw is what happened, and what Gerald Sutton accused you of is what he was doing to you, and everyone who believed him over you was wrong, and you have been carrying shame that never belonged to you for reasons that had nothing to do with your character and everything to do with the character of a man who could not accept being told no by a woman he had decided he wanted. Use these letters, my darling. If the day ever comes when you need them, use them. Tell the truth publicly. Make people look at evidence instead of reputation. Make them reckon with what was done to you and what it cost you and what it cost this family and what it cost the women who came after you who encountered the same man and had no one to warn them. Because Gerald Sutton did not stop with you. I have heard things over the years that suggest you were not the first and were not the last. A man who does what he did and faces no consequences does not change. He simply becomes more careful. I love you more than I have ever found adequate words to express. I am sorry I was not brave enough when bravery mattered most. I hope that whatever brought you to this basement is not the worst thing that has ever happened to you, but I prepared these letters for the possibility that it might be. You are stronger than you know. You always have been. Your grandmother who failed you but never stopped loving you. Cornelia Ashworth. The letter ended there mid-sentence, almost the way things end when the person ending them has run out of time or strength or both. The last line was slightly larger than the rest, the letters less precise, written by a hand that was reaching the limit of what it could do and was determined to finish regardless. Margaret sat with the 4 pages in her lap for a long time. She did not move. She did not speak. She sat on the packed earth floor of the basement in the last light of the October evening, and she read the letter a second time and then a third time, and she let each reading settle into her differently, the way the same piece of music settles differently, depending on how many times you have heard it and what has happened to you between hearings. Outside, the light had moved fully into evening. The gold band across the threshold had faded, and the air coming through the open door was sharper now, carrying the particular cold of a Virginia October night beginning to assert itself. Somewhere in the trees on the hillside above the basement, something moved through the dry leaves, a small animal, or just the wind making its rounds through the forest before settling in for the night. Margaret looked at the 3 letters arranged on the earth floor beside her. Winifred Crane's careful, small script, Franklin Aldis's large, unhurried hand, and her grandmother's voice spinning itself across 4 pages to deliver what it had been holding for 50 years. She thought about Gerald Sutton. She had heard things over the decades in the way you hear things in a small town, even when you exist at its social margins, even when most of its residents treat you with the particular careful distance that people maintain around someone they have decided is contaminated by association with scandal. She had heard that he was still at Cedar Hollow Community Church, still preaching, still beloved, still the civic figure whose opinion carried weight in matters both spiritual and practical. She had heard vaguely and without specifics that there had been other situations over the years. Other women, other sudden departures from positions in the church's organizational structure that were explained in terms that were not quite satisfying if you thought about them carefully enough. She had not thought about them carefully. She had not permitted herself to. Thinking carefully about Gerald Sutton required entering a territory of her own history that she had spent 40 years managing from a safe distance, and the cost of entering it without a reason sufficient to justify the cost was more than she had been willing to pay. She had a reason now. She gathered the 3 letters carefully and folded them and returned them to their envelopes and placed the envelopes in the inside pocket of her coat, close to her chest where she could feel them with each breath. She looked at the wedding dress spread across her lap, the ivory silk that had preserved its color in Cornelia's careful tissue paper, the lace applique still holding its pattern after 40 years of sealed darkness. She thought about what Cornelia had said. She thought about what her hands could do. She thought about Sunday. Cedar Hollow's fellowship hour had been a tradition for 30 years, a gathering in the town square every Sunday morning at 9 o'clock before the 10 o'clock service at the church, where community members collected with coffee and conversation in the open air and conducted the informal social business of a small town that preferred its relationships face to face. She had attended it herself in the early years of her marriage to Thomas, before the accumulated weight of being that woman had made public gatherings more painful than they were worth. She knew what it looked like, how many people came, how the square filled with the particular density of a community that still believed in the value of showing up in the same place at the same time. She knew that Gerald Sutton was always there. She knew because she had heard it over the years, his continued presence described in the tone people use for beloved fixtures, for things that have been in the same place for so long that their being there has stopped requiring comment and become simply part of the expected landscape. She knew he held court at these gatherings with the ease of a man who has spent decades in the habit of being the most important person in any room he enters. She picked up the wedding dress. She turned it over in her hands, examining it the way she examined all fabric, with the combination of visual and tactile attention that her training had made automatic. The silk had survived extraordinarily well. 40 years in a sealed trunk in a controlled underground environment had been paradoxically better preservation than any amount of professional archival treatment. The color was still true. The lace still held. The construction was sound throughout. She could work with this. She had worked with worse. She had spent 50 years solving problems with needle and thread and the capacity to see not what a piece of fabric was, but what it could become with the right application of skill and intention. What she was looking at was not a relic. It was raw material. Her sewing kit was in the suitcase. She opened it and laid its contents out on the trunk lid, organizing them in the order that she was likely to need them, the way she always organized her tools before beginning a project. Scissors of 3 different sizes, needles in their paper envelope, thread in the color she had packed, including she was grateful to discover ivory and cream that would match the silk closely enough to work, a small pincushion, a seam ripper. She lifted the dress and held it up in the beam of the flashlight, rotating it, slowly examining every element with the critical eye of someone who was about to make decisions about it. The train would have to go. The extended back length was the most obviously bridal element of the construction, the part that communicated wedding with the most insistence. Removing it would require careful work at the back seam and then a clean hem that matched the existing skirt line, but it was not complicated work, and her hands had done more complicated things on less sleep than she had gotten recently. The veil attachment points would need to be removed and the fabric closed over the small holes they left. Minor work. The neckline was the most significant structural challenge. As she had designed it, it was romantic, the neckline of a dress made for a specific occasion and a specific kind of day. What she needed was something more austere, more deliberate, something that communicated intention rather than celebration. She could recut the neckline. She had enough material in the train she was removing to use as facing if needed. The old shawl she had packed was a deep charcoal gray, heavier wool, one of the few things she had kept from the house. Draped correctly over the modified bodice, it would change the character of the entire garment, would shift it from something that announced itself as a wedding dress to something that announced itself as a statement. She had not made a statement in 40 years. She was 75 years old, sleeping on a pile of folded blankets on the packed earth floor of her grandmother's basement, with the remnants of her entire life fitting comfortably in a single suitcase, and she was going to walk into Cedar Hollow's town square on Sunday morning and say what had needed to be said for 4 decades. She threaded a needle. She worked through the night. There is a particular quality to work done by flashlight in a stone room while the world above is sleeping. The light creates a circle of clarity in the surrounding dark, and inside that circle, everything is sharp and immediate and entirely focused, and outside it, nothing exists at all. Margaret worked inside that circle with the full concentration of someone who has been given a limited amount of time and a specific amount of material and understands that the quality of what emerges from their hands in the next several hours will matter considerably. The train came off first. She cut it cleanly along the back seam, separating it from the skirt with the decisive sound of good scissors through silk, and set it aside. The raw edge left behind, she worked into a hem that matched the existing skirt line, her stitches small and even the muscle memory of 50 years guiding her hands through the familiar motions. The veil attachments came next, 4 small metal hooks that she removed carefully and then closed the fabric over with tiny invisible stitches that would not be visible at any distance, likely to be relevant in a public square. The neckline took the most time. She considered it for 20 minutes before she cut, turning the dress on her lap, holding pieces of the train material against different portions of the bodice, imagining the finished result. When she finally cut, she cut with the confidence of someone who has spent enough time deciding to have arrived at the decision completely. What she made was not a wedding neckline. It was the neckline of a woman who had something important to say and had dressed with the specific intention of being taken seriously when she said it. She draped the gray shawl over her shoulders when the structural work was done, arranging it against the modified bodice, adjusting the fold and the hang of it until it settled the way she wanted. She looked at herself in the small, compact mirror. She had kept turning it at different angles to see as much as the small glass would allow. She did not see a woman in a wedding dress. She saw a woman in ivory silk and gray wool who looked like someone that other people would think twice about dismissing. That would do. The dawn came gradually through the open basement door, the quality of the darkness outside shifting from the full dark of deep night to the particular gray of early morning, that hour, when the world is visible but not yet illuminated. Margaret had been working for approximately 7 hours. Her back ached with the particular protest of a 75-year-old spine that has been bent over close work for an extended period, and her eyes were tired in the way that comes from sustained concentration in inadequate light, and her hands, which had been doing the most precise work they had done in years, felt the particular fatigue of muscles that had been asked to perform at their limit. She set down her needle. She looked at the dress in the flashlight beam and then at the gray light beginning to fill the doorway, and she sat for a while in the silence between night and morning and let herself feel without resistance the full accumulation of the past 24 hours. The sidewalk outside 412 Meadowbrook Lane, her children's voices, the donation truck, Harrison's voice through the study door measuring the cost of helping her and deciding it was too high, the 3 miles down the county road with the suitcase, the smell of lavender when the basement door opened, the trunk, the seal, the dress, the letters. Winifred Crane's guilt archived in small, careful script. Franklin Aldis's shame documented in that large, unhurried hand. Cornelia's voice spending its last reserves across 4 pages to deliver what it had been protecting for 50 years. She got up from the floor, moving carefully, attending to each joint's response to the change of position with the patient negotiation that age required. She found the jug of water she had brought and drank from it. She ate the last of the food she had packed. Crackers and a piece of hard cheese that was drier than it had been yesterday but still edible. Then she put on the dress. The silk settled against her body with the particular quality of silk that fits correctly, a quality she recognized from 50 years of making things that were supposed to fit and the thousand small satisfactions of achieving that correctly. The modifications she had made changed the garment's conversation with the world, from celebration to intention, and she could feel that change in the way it wore, in the way it made her stand and hold her shoulders and lift her chin. She draped the gray shawl, adjusted the fold. She did her hair with the small comb she had packed, working her white curls into a shape that communicated care and intention, rather than the casual arrangement of someone who had not been paying attention. She was not a vain woman. She had not been a vain woman in 30 years. But she understood with the practical intelligence of someone who had spent her life understanding how things look and what that looking communicates, that how she appeared this morning mattered. She was not going to appear defeated. She was going to appear like someone who had found what she came for and knew exactly what to do with it. At 8:45 in the morning, Margaret Whitfield picked up her coat and her cloth bag containing the 3 letters and walked to the basement door. She stood for a moment in the threshold, 1 foot in the underground and 1 foot in the morning air, the October light falling on her face and the smell of the forest and the fields coming to her after the enclosed smell of the basement, and she breathed it in fully. Then she walked out into the morning and started toward Cedar Hollow. The town square was already filling when she arrived. She had made the 3 mile walk in just over an hour, moving at a pace that her body could sustain, without damage that paid the necessary attention to the uneven ground of the county road and the slight ache that had settled into her lower back from the night's work. The October morning was clear and cold. The sky a hard bright blue that suggested the kind of autumn day that Cedar Hollow occasionally produced, and that people who lived there talked about for weeks afterward. The square was laid out around a central green with an old gazebo at its center, surrounded by the commercial buildings that had been the core of Cedar Hollow's downtown for as long as anyone currently living could remember. A hardware store, a pharmacy, a diner, a small grocery. The fellowship hour had been filling this space every Sunday morning for 3 decades, and the infrastructure of the tradition was visible in the tables set up near the gazebo, the coffee urns steaming in the cold air, the arrangement of folding chairs and standing clusters of people in their Sunday clothes, conducting the social business of a community that still believed in showing up. Margaret paused at the edge of the square and took it in. She saw faces she had known for 40 years, people who had whispered about her, and people who had not, but had never said anything to counteract the whispering. People who had taken their business away from her seamstress shop in the years after the scandal, and people who had eventually returned not because they had changed their minds about anything, but because she was the best alteration seamstress in the county, and convenience eventually outweighs social positioning. People who had watched her bury Thomas and had come to the service not because they fully believed in her innocence, but because funerals required attendance from people who considered themselves decent. She saw Harrison. He was standing near the coffee table with a cup in one hand and his phone in the other. His Sunday clothes slightly at odds with the expression of a man conducting a workday, speaking to Clarice, who stood beside him, with her arms crossed in the arrangement Margaret had come to think of as her default posture. She saw Prescott a short distance away, standing with his wife and children, looking at his shoes with the familiar quality of a man waiting for something to be over. None of them had seen her yet. And in the center of the largest cluster of people positioned with the ease of someone who has occupied the central position of every room he has entered for 40 years without having to think about how to get there stood Reverend Gerald Sutton. He was 79 years old. He had aged in the way that certain men age, the kind who were handsome in their 40s and who carry the structural memory of that handsomeness into their later decades as a kind of residue, the bones still suggesting the face that was. His hair was white and well kept. He stood with the particular upright quality of a man who understands that posture communicates authority. He was speaking to the four people nearest him with the animated pleasure of someone who has never stopped enjoying the sound of his own voice reaching an appreciative audience. He was laughing. Margaret watched him laugh, watched the people around him respond with their own laughter, watched the social machinery of his continued respectability operate with the smooth efficiency of something that has been running without meaningful interruption for decades. And she felt something settle in her chest that was not anger and was not grief and was not anything she had a precise name for. It was clarity. The particular clarity that comes when you have been carrying something for so long that the carrying of it has become indistinguishable from your ordinary experience of being alive. And then something changes and you set it down, and the absence of it is so complete that the world looks different, that your own body feels different, that the question of what to do next has only one answer, and the answer requires no deliberation at all. She had not planned exactly what she would say. She had spent the night working with her hands rather than her words, trusting that the words would be there when she needed them, in the way that they had always been there for the important moments of her life emerging from some deeper place than preparation. She had the letters. She had what she knew. She had 50 years of practice at being told to be quiet in the specific exhaustion of someone who has finally decided that the cost of continued silence is higher than any cost the alternative could produce. She walked into the square. The first people to notice her noticed the dress. That was the sequence of it, the dress registering before the face for most people, which was exactly as she had anticipated. There was a particular quality to ivory silk in October morning light that demanded attention, and the combination of the dress and the gray shawl and the careful white hair of a 75-year-old woman moving through a crowd with deliberate purpose created a visual impression that stopped conversations in the way that genuinely unexpected things stop them, without the polite, gradual trailing off of a natural pause. Whispers followed her through the crowd like a current through water. "Is that Margaret Whitfield? What on earth is she wearing? Why would she come here?" She moved through the whispers without acknowledging them, her eyes fixed on the figure at the center of the large group near the gazebo, her pace steady and unhurried, the pace of someone who has somewhere specific to be and has allocated sufficient time to get there. She saw the moment Sutton registered her presence. He was mid-sentence when some shift in the attention of the people around him caused him to follow their eyes, and his eyes found her. And for one fraction of a second before the decades of practice control reasserted themselves, she saw his face do something unguarded, something that moved too quickly to be fully cataloged, but that she recognized in the instant of its passing, because she had spent 40 years carrying the weight of his lie, and she knew what fear looked like on the face of the person who had told it. He was afraid. He composed himself immediately. The warmth came back, the habitual expression of a man who has learned to meet every situation with the performance of benevolent confidence. But she had seen what was underneath. It had seen it in that fraction of a second before the mask returned, and she carried that knowledge with her as she covered the last 10 yards between them and stopped directly in front of him. The crowd around them had gone quiet. "Reverend Sutton," she said. Her voice came out clear and even and carried in the cold morning air, with the specificity of something that has been decided upon rather than improvised. Around her, the conversations that had been continuing elsewhere in the square were dying, people turning toward the gazebo, drawn by the particular quality of silence that signals something real happening in a space accustomed to the managed performance of community socializing. "I have something that has been waiting a very long time to be delivered to you," she said, "and I believe this is the correct occasion." She reached into her cloth bag and removed the three letters. She held them up, not dramatically, not with the theatrical gesture of someone performing for an audience, but with the practical directness of someone presenting evidence that speaks for itself to people capable of understanding what they are looking at. The envelopes were visible. The age of them was visible. The fact of their existence, three documents retrieved from somewhere that suggested years of preservation and deliberate protection communicated something before a word of their contents was spoken. 40 years ago, she said, addressing the crowd that had formed around them, rather than Sutton directly, you were told a story about me. You were told that I had behaved inappropriately toward this man, that I had propositioned him, that I had pursued him, and been rejected and reacted with threats. You were told this story by a person you trusted and respected, and whose word you had no reason to question, and you believed it as people believe things told to them by trusted sources, especially when the alternative requires believing something uncomfortable about someone they admire. She paused. Let that settle. I am here to tell you that story was a lie. The square was very quiet now. I am here to tell you that what he accused me of doing is precisely what he was doing to me. That he pursued me repeatedly and despite clear refusals. That when I continued to reject him, he decided the most effective protection of his own position was the destruction of mine. And I am here to tell you that I have documentation of this truth from 2 witnesses who saw what happened and were too afraid of this man's power to speak publicly, but who had consciences that would not permit them to remain entirely silent. She held up the first envelope. Gerald Sutton's own secretary was in the office the day he called me in for what he described as a wedding planning meeting. She heard him through the door. She heard me refuse him. She heard him prepare the lie he would tell afterward. She was too frightened to speak then because her family's livelihood depended on his goodwill. She put what she witnessed in writing instead and gave it to my grandmother because her conscience would not let her do nothing. She heard a sound from somewhere in the crowd, a sharp intake of breath, and she did not look to find its source because she did not need to. A local businessman witnessed Sutton following me to the church parking lot one evening, weeks before the public accusation. He watched him block my path, take hold of my arm when I tried to leave, repeat the action when I freed myself. He saw me push his hand away before I finally managed to get in my car and drive away. He was too afraid of the financial consequences of opposing this man to testify publicly. He wrote down what he saw and sent it to my grandmother. She held up the second envelope. And my grandmother, she said, and her voice changed slightly here, the way a voice changes when it moves from evidence to testimony, from the external to the intimate. My grandmother tried to bring this evidence forward 40 years ago. She had appointments with the church elders. She was prepared to stand in front of them with these letters and demand that they reckon with what they showed. She stopped. Sutton came to her house. She said it without embellishment, without dramatic weight added to what the words already carried on their own. He sat in her front room and told her what would happen to me if she tried to use these letters. What would happen to my husband's business? What kind of life I could expect if she forced this confrontation. He described it specifically and without apparent emotion, the way a man describes outcomes he has already decided upon and is merely announcing. And my grandmother believed him because she understood exactly how much of this town he controlled, and she chose to protect what little I had rather than risk losing it entirely in a fight she was not certain she could win. She set the third envelope on top of the others in her hand. She was wrong to stay silent. She knew it. She wrote it down. She sewed these letters into the lining of the wedding dress I never got to wear to the wedding he canceled, sealed them in a trunk, and left them for me to find when I finally had nothing left to lose. She looked at him directly. I am 75 years old. I was evicted from my home 3 days ago. I have nothing. I have one suitcase and a dress I made 40 years ago for a day you stole from me. And I am standing in front of you in this square, in front of every person in this town who believed your lie and made me carry your shame for 4 decades, and I am asking you to tell the truth. The silence around them had the quality of held breath. The gathered fellowship hour crowd, perhaps 150 people, had arranged itself without conscious intention into an audience standing in the curve of space that forms naturally when people want to witness something and understand instinctively that the thing they are witnessing requires their full attention. Did you lie about me? She said. Her voice was steady, completely steady in the way of something that has been decided so completely that no further effort is required to maintain it. Did you pursue me when I was engaged to another man? Did you corner me and touch me when I tried to leave? Did you lie to the church elders to protect yourself when I refused you? Did you steal my wedding and my reputation in 40 years of my life because I had the temerity to say no to a man who expected to hear yes? Sutton had not spoken since she began. He had stood with the forced stillness of a man who understands that any movement he makes will be read as something and has not yet calculated what movement is least damaging. His face had performed several things during her speaking, cycling through the available options: the wounded dignity of someone falsely accused the patient, tolerance of a man accustomed to dealing with difficult situations, the benevolent concern of a pastor for a troubled soul. None of them had held. Each one had been tried and found insufficient to the specific weight of what was happening and had been abandoned. What remained on his face now, as she stood before him, with the letters in her hand and the crowd gathered around them and the October light falling cleanly on everything, was something that had no performance left in it. He looked old, not the distinguished old of a man whose age has added gravitas to an already substantial presence. Simply old in the way of a structure whose facade has been removed to reveal what was underneath it all along. "This is a deeply troubling situation," he said, and his voice was less than it had been, thinner than the voice she remembered from 40 years ago, less able to fill a space and command it. "I have always sought to serve this community with integrity," he began, and the words had the sound of something that had been used many times before in many situations and had worn smooth with the repetition. "Did you lie?" Margaret said again. Simple, direct, the same words, the same voice delivered with the same steadiness as the first time. "Because these letters say you did. These witnesses say you did. And I have been standing in front of you for 10 minutes presenting evidence that says you did. And what I need from you right now is not a prepared statement about your commitment to community service. What I need is the truth. One word if that's all you can manage. Did you lie about me, yes or no?" The silence lasted perhaps 10 seconds. In those 10 seconds, Margaret watched a calculation happen in another person's face with the clarity of someone who has spent 50 years reading the precise language of how things are made and how they hold together and how they fail when the materials are no longer adequate to the stress applied to them. Gerald Sutton was 79 years old. He had spent 40 years maintaining a specific weight of deception, and the infrastructure that had supported that weight, the trust of his congregation, the respect of his community, the absolute confidence of a man who had never been successfully challenged, was no longer fully intact. The letters were real. The crowd was watching. And whatever calculation he was making as he stood in front of her in the Cedar Hollow town square on this October Sunday morning, the numbers were not coming out in his favor. "Yes," he said, it came out quietly, barely above a conversational volume. But the square was quiet enough that it reached the edges of the gathered crowd without difficulty. He said it again, slightly louder. "Yes, I pursued you. You refused me repeatedly and clearly, and I was angry about it, and I was afraid of what you might say, and I told the elders a version of events that was the opposite of what actually happened. I told them you had done what I had done to you, and I have lived with that for 40 years. The crowd erupted, not all at once, not in a single unified response, in the fragmented, overlapping way that a large group of people respond to receiving information that requires them to revise a 40-year-old belief, voices rising and falling and rising again, some in shock, some in the particular vocal quality of someone who is realizing they have been wrong for a very long time, some in the defensive register of people who trusted the wrong thing and are not yet sure how to process that discovery. Margaret did not watch the crowd. She was watching Harrison. He had been standing at the edge of the gathering from early on, had made his way toward the center of it as the situation developed, and she had been aware of him throughout without giving him her direct attention. Now she looked at him, looked at the face of her 50-year-old son, who had not been able to put down his phone long enough to look at her while she stood on the sidewalk outside her former home 3 days ago, watching her life being loaded into a donation truck. He was looking at her now. His face had the expression of a man who has received information that requires him to rearrange the internal furniture of his understanding significantly and is in the process of discovering how heavy some of that furniture is. She watched him do the accounting, watched him trace the implications backward through 40 years of half-believed rumors and carefully maintain distance and the particular shame a child carries when they have grown up in the shadow of a story that their parent insisted was wrong and they could never quite bring themselves to fully believe. She watched him understand. She turned away before he could say anything. Whatever he needed to say to her could wait. Whatever Clarice needed to say, and Prescott and the 50 people who would approach her in the next hour wanting to express their belated conviction of her innocence could wait. She walked to the edge of the crowd. She stood at the edge of it and looked back at the gazebo and the October light and the old buildings of Cedar Hollows downtown that she had passed 10,000 times in the 40 years she had lived here. And she felt something she could not name precisely, but that she recognized as the sensation of a weight being redistributed, not removed. She was not naive enough to believe that 40 years of injustice could be fully redistributed in a single morning in a town square, but redistributed in the specific sense of being lifted from the shoulders of the person who had been carrying it alone and placed back in the world where it belonged in the open air, where it could be seen and examined and assigned to its actual source. She had carried it alone for 40 years. She was done carrying it alone, Bung. From across the square, she heard her name in a voice she did not immediately place. She turned. A woman perhaps 50 years old was making her way toward her through the dispersing crowd, moving with the purposeful quality of someone who has been waiting for something for a long time and has just seen it finally begin and is not going to let the moment pass without doing what they came to do. Mrs. Whitfield, the woman said, reaching her slightly out of breath. She was a solid, plain-faced woman with her mother's large eyes. Margaret realized with the particular jolt of recognition that comes when a genetic inheritance reaches across decades to announce itself. "My name is Nora Aldous," the woman said. "Franklin Aldous was my father." Margaret looked at her. "He passed in 2018. She said it quietly, the way you say the facts of loss when they have settled into their permanent shape. "He was 78 years old, and he was carrying that letter until the day he died. He told me about it, not the details, but the fact of it, that he had seen something he should have spoken about and hadn't, and that he had put the truth in writing and sent it to your grandmother, and that if a day ever came when that truth was needed, he wanted someone to be there to say that his testimony was real, that he meant every word of it, that it was the truth as he witnessed it." She stopped, steadied herself. "I've been waiting for 7 years without knowing if this day would ever come," she said. "I am glad it did. I am glad for you. And I think my father would have been glad too, even though he would also have been ashamed that he needed his daughter to speak for him rather than speaking for himself." Margaret looked at Nora Aldous for a long moment. She thought about Franklin sitting in his office in 1985, writing that letter with his large, unhurried hand, choosing his words with the care of someone who knows they are documenting something important and wants the documentation to be exact. She thought about him carrying the letter to the post office and then carrying the knowledge of it for 33 years and then passing it on to his daughter with the specific request that she be present if the day ever came. He did what he could, Margaret said, with what he had and what he was able to do. That matters. Nora nodded. Something in her face eased slightly, the way a face eases when it receives something it has been waiting to receive without knowing it was waiting. From behind Margaret, she heard a voice, careful and controlled, stripped of its usual managed confidence, trying to find a register it had not used in a long time. "Mom," she turned. Harrison stood 2 feet behind her with his phone in his hand and his Sunday clothes in the face of a man who has just done the arithmetic on 40 years of choices and found the sum to be something he will have to live with for the rest of his life. She looked at him. She said nothing yet. She let him stand in it because some things need to be stood in before they can be addressed, and the quality of silence she maintained was not unkind, but it was precise. It was the silence of someone who has been waiting for a particular understanding to arrive in a particular person and is willing to give it the time it needs to settle. He would speak when he was ready. The crowd was still moving around them, the square still processing what had just happened, people in conversations that would continue through the week and longer. The October light was fully morning now, clear and definitive, the kind of light that shows things as they are, without flattery or obscuration. Marga Harrison Whitfield had been a lawyer for 23 years. He had spent those 23 years in the precise and demanding work of constructing arguments, of building cases from the available evidence, of understanding how facts arrange themselves into narratives that courts and juries and opposing counsel could be made to accept or reject depending on the quality of the construction. He had learned early in his career that the most dangerous moment in any case was not the moment of weakest evidence, but the moment when the lawyer himself stopped believing in what he was arguing, when the gap between the case as presented and the truth as understood became too wide to sustain without visible strain. He had been a very good lawyer in part because He had always been honest with himself about that gap when it existed. He was being honest with himself about it now. "Mom," he said again. And then because he was his mother's son, regardless of everything else that was also true about him, and because there are moments when the accumulated weight of what you have done and failed to do reaches a mass that cannot be carried another step in the direction you have been walking, he stopped performing the management of the situation and simply stood in front of her with his face doing what faces do when a person stops managing them. "I knew," he said. His voice was low. Not the deliberate low of a man controlling his public presentation, but the involuntary low of someone speaking from a place that does not have access to volume. "I knew about the tenant rights options. I knew from the first week after Walter Pruitt died that there was a legal argument available, substantial enough to buy time, possibly substantial enough to win outright." Margaret watched him. "I told myself it was complicated," he continued. "I told myself the outcome was uncertain, and the timeline was long, and I had too much going on. I told myself it was probably better for you to make a clean break. I used every version of that argument I could construct, and I constructed them very carefully, because I am good at constructing arguments, and I knew that if I didn't build them carefully enough, I would be able to see through them myself." He stopped, looked at the letters in her hand, looked at the crowd still dispersing around them in the October morning light. "I have been seeing through them for 3 days," he said, "since the morning you walked away down that sidewalk with your suitcase. And then when the video started last night, and I watched what happened here this morning on someone's phone, and I understood what you had found and what you had done with it." He paused again. "What you did alone, because I was not here." Margaret let the silence hold for a moment. There was something she needed to say, and she was taking the time to find it precisely the way she took the time to find the precise cut before she made it, because imprecision in certain moments costs more than the time the precision requires. "You have been ashamed of me," she said, more as an accusation, as a statement of fact delivered in the same steady register she had used all morning. "For a very long time, since you were old enough to understand that other children's mothers were not talked about the way your mother was talked about. Since you were old enough to notice the way certain rooms changed when we entered them together. You were ashamed, and you managed that shame by maintaining a certain distance. And over the years, the distance became the default condition of our relationship, and you stopped questioning it because questioning it would have required you to examine what was underneath it." Harrison did not deny this. That was the thing about him. She had always known it, that beneath the performance of competence and control, there was a person who, when the situation stripped away the performance entirely, was capable of a particular quality of honesty that most people found too costly to sustain. It was the quality that had made him a good lawyer. It was the quality that was costing him considerably right now. And when the eviction came, she continued, "You had a choice. You could have used your knowledge and your skills to fight for me, or you could have allowed the situation to resolve in the way that required the least from you." She looked at him evenly. "You chose the second option, and you dressed that choice in practical language and delivered it to me with the confidence of a professional opinion so that neither of us would have to look directly at what it actually was." He closed his eyes briefly. "Yes," he said. The single word carried a weight disproportionate to its size, the way single words sometimes do when they have been the accurate word for a long time and have accumulated everything that should have been said in the months and years when they were not said. "I need you to understand something," Margaret said. "Not as a condition of my forgiveness, not as a prerequisite for a relationship going forward. I need you to understand it because I think you have the capacity to understand it, and because I think not understanding it will cost you something significant for the rest of your life. And I did not carry you through 3 colicky months and a learning disability and 2 breakups and a bar exam to watch you not understand the most important thing." He looked at her. "For 40 years, she said, I told you the truth. Not once, continuously. Every time the subject came up, every time someone's comment or whisper or carefully managed avoidance required me to address it, I told you the same truth, and you could not quite bring yourself to fully believe me. Not because you had evidence against what I said, but because the alternative required believing something uncomfortable about someone the community around you respected and admired, and believing me fully would have required carrying that belief publicly in a world that had decided otherwise, and that was a cost you were not willing to pay." She paused. That is not a failure of intelligence or legal training. That is a failure of love. And it is the one I am asking you to sit with, not as punishment, but because sitting with it fully and honestly is the only way to the other side of it. Harrison stood in the October morning with his phone in his hand, in his careful Sunday clothes, in his 50-year-old face doing something that 50-year-old faces do only when they have been reached at a depth below the layers that 50 years of professional and personal maintenance have built up. Something that looked in the light of this particular morning like the beginning of understanding. I don't know how to fix it, he said. You can't fix it, Margaret said. That word implies returning something to a previous condition. There is no previous condition worth returning to. What you can do is decide what kind of son you are going to be from today forward with full knowledge of what today revealed. She looked at him steadily. That choice is still available. It is the only choice still available, and what you do with it is entirely up to you. She turned. She was done with that conversation for now. Not forever. But for now, because she had said what needed to be said, and she had said it clearly, and anything further was repetition, and she had never been a woman who repeated herself when once was sufficient. Clarice was standing 15 feet away, with tears on her face that she was not making any effort to conceal, which was in itself a departure from the habitual Clarice that Margaret had observed for 48 years. Prescott was beside her with his hands in his jacket pockets and his eyes up from the ground for once. And what was on his face was not the performed concern of someone managing a difficult situation, but something rawer and less polished than that. Margaret looked at both of them. Later she said, all of this, later. When I have slept and eaten something that is not 48-hour-old crackers, and when the square has cleared enough that the conversation we need to have can happen in something approximating privacy. They both nodded. Immediately without argument, the way people nod when they understand that they have forfeited their usual negotiating position and are operating in a new arrangement. Across the square, she could see that Gerald Sutton was no longer visible in the crowd. He had not walked away. She had seen him in the peripheral awareness she had maintained throughout everything move toward the bench near the gazebo and sit down with the quality of motion of a person whose legs have made the decision for them. Two men she did not recognize, younger men in the clothing of deacons, were speaking to him with the urgent quiet of people managing a situation they had not anticipated and for which they had no established protocol. She did not feel triumph. She had expected to feel something that she would have called triumph when she imagined this moment, in the abstract way she had occasionally imagined it over the decades without ever quite believing it would be real. What she actually felt was quieter than that and less dramatic, and in some ways more complete. The specific piece of a person who has done the thing they came to do and can now turn their attention to what comes next. Nora Aldous was still nearby, standing at a respectful distance, waiting with the patience of someone who has learned that important things happen on their own schedule, and rushing them is not among the available options. Margaret walked to her. Thank you, she said, for being here, for waiting as long as you waited. Nora nodded. He would have wanted to be here himself, she said. He was not a brave man about this. She said it without apology and without excess shame, the way you say true things about people you loved who were imperfect in specific ways. But he was an honest man. He knew what he saw, and he wrote down what he knew, and he wanted the writing to matter eventually. I'm glad it did. They stood together for a moment in the diminishing crowd, two women of different generations connected by the thread of something that had happened 40 years ago in a church parking lot and had traveled through time in the ink of a man who had not been brave enough to speak, but had been honest enough to write. Then Margaret thanked her again and turned toward the edge of the square and began the walk back toward the county road in the 3 miles to the basement, in the suitcase, and whatever came next. Whatever came next turned out to be considerably more than she had anticipated. The video appeared online sometime in the late afternoon of Sunday. She did not know this until the following morning, when she woke on her folded blankets in the basement to the sound of something she had not heard in years, and it took her a moment to identify. Her phone, which she had kept on more from habit than expectation, was ringing with a frequency that suggested it had been ringing for some time, and she had slept through the earlier attempts. The number on the screen was unfamiliar. She let it go to the voicemail she was not sure still worked, and then lay on her blankets and watched the October morning light come through the open basement door and thought about the night she had just passed, which had been the first night in perhaps years that she had slept without the specific quality of tension that comes from a weight being carried even during sleep. She checked the voicemail. A journalist from the regional newspaper. She put the phone down and it rang again almost immediately. A different number, a different area code. She let that one go too, and then the next one, and then she put on her coat and went to sit in the basement doorway in the morning air with the phone in her hand and watch the missed calls accumulate while the sun moved through the trees on the hillside. Clarice arrived at the property on foot sometime around 10 in the morning, slightly breathless from the walk with a paper bag in one hand that turned out to contain a proper breakfast and her phone in the other that she held out to Margaret the moment she was within speaking distance. The video, she said, was being watched. Margaret took the phone. Someone had recorded the confrontation in the square on a cell phone beginning from roughly the point when she had arrived in the crowd's field of vision. The video was 3 minutes and 47 seconds long and had been posted to several social media platforms Sunday afternoon. By Sunday evening, it had been viewed, according to the number displayed beneath it, just over 40,000 times. By the time Clarice was standing in the doorway of Cornelia's basement, showing it to her Monday morning, the number had added a zero. 75-year-old woman confronts pastor who destroyed her life, said the headline on the local news website that had picked it up Sunday night. Elderly seamstress produces 40-year-old evidence cleared of decades-old false accusation, said the regional paper that had picked it up Monday morning. Margaret watched 20 seconds of the video, watched herself walk through the crowd in the ivory silk and the gray shawl, white-haired and unhurried, watched herself stop in front of the man who had stolen 40 years from her and say what she had come to say. She handed Clarice's phone back. She ate the breakfast Clarice had brought. Scrambled eggs and toast and coffee in a proper cup, and she ate it sitting in the basement doorway in the October sun, and she did not say very much because she was thinking, and Clarice, to her credit, seemed to understand that silence was the appropriate response to thinking and maintained it. By Tuesday, 3 regional television stations had located the property. She spoke to each of them once briefly and carefully, standing at the basement door, in clean clothes, the letters in her hands saying what was true and nothing beyond what was true. She told them about the eviction. She told them about the 3-mile walk with the suitcase. She pointed them about the trunk and the seal and the wedding dress and the letters hidden in its lining. She told them what the letters said and who had written them and why they had been hidden and for how long. She told them about Cornelia. The Cornelia portion of the story she understood was the part that reached people who had never heard of Cedar Hollow and would never visit it. An old woman preserving truth for 50 years against the day it would be needed, sealing it in a trunk in a basement, and leaving a key in the palm of her granddaughter's hand, trusting that the right moment would come, even if neither of them lived to see it arrive. This was the part of the story that spread fastest, that was shared the most, that generated the specific quality of response that comes when something touches a universal nerve. By Wednesday, the story had been picked up nationally. Gerald Sutton resigned from the charitable foundation he had chaired for 15 years by Wednesday afternoon in a statement issued by his attorney that said nothing except that he was stepping back for personal reasons and wished the organization continued success. The church issued a formal statement of apology to Margaret on Thursday, acknowledging that she had been wrongly accused, that the evidence presented was credible, and the community's response in 1985 had been unjust, and that the congregation was committed to making whatever amends were possible. The statement was carefully worded and contained several passages that had clearly been reviewed by legal counsel before publication, but it was public and it was signed, and it said the word wrongly in a sentence that had her name in it, and that mattered. People she had not spoken to in decades reached out. Some of them she had expected. Others surprised her, people she had written off entirely as belonging to the permanent column of those who had decided against her contacting her, with the particular tone of the genuinely remorseful rather than the performatively contrite. She made careful distinctions between these categories. She had earned the right to make those distinctions, and she exercised it without apology. Winifred Crane called on Thursday evening. Margaret had wondered about this, had turned it over in her mind, in the quiet hours since Sunday, how Winifred must have felt watching the confrontation in the square, whether she had been there, whether she had watched the video, what the experience of being named as a witness in a public accounting of this magnitude was like for a woman who had spent 40 years living with the guilt of having been too afraid to speak. Winifred's voice on the phone was not what Margaret had expected. She had expected fragility. She had expected the voice of someone braced for consequences. What she heard instead was something that sounded like relief of a very specific kind. The relief of a person setting down something they have been carrying so long that the weight has become inseparable from their ordinary experience of moving through the world, and the absence of it is simultaneously strange and overwhelmingly welcome. I have wanted to call you for 40 years, Winifred said. I have dialed numbers I found for you 4 times over the decades and hung up before the call connected because I could not find words adequate to what I needed to say. She paused. I still don't have adequate words, but I wanted you to know that what I wrote in that letter was true. Every word of it. And I am glad that your grandmother kept it and glad that you found it and glad that it mattered when you needed it to. Margaret told her that it had mattered considerably. She told her that the courage it had taken to write the letter at all, even privately, even to a recipient who would keep it hidden rather than act on it, was a form of courage that should not be dismissed simply because it had not taken the form that would have been most useful. She told her that she understood the calculation Winifred had made and that she did not require Winifred to spend another 40 years in guilt over a choice that had been made under genuine duress with real stakes on both sides. Winifred was quiet for a long moment after that. Then she said very simply, "Thank you." The 2 words carried everything they needed to carry, and nothing was added to them. The lawyer called on Friday. He introduced himself as Philip Danforth, a civil litigation attorney in Charlottesville, who had seen the story on Wednesday and had spent 2 days reviewing the publicly available information before calling. He said he was calling pro bono. He said the case as he understood it from what was publicly known was among the most straightforward examples of defamation causing documented economic and social harm that he had encountered in 30 years of practice, and that if even a portion of what had been described publicly was accurate, the evidentiary foundation was unusually strong. He said Gerald Sutton was a wealthy man, not extravagantly so, not the kind of wealth that could endure indefinitely against determined legal action, but the accumulated wealth of an inheritance invested carefully over decades of a man who had lived modestly by the standards of his resources and had allowed those resources to grow. The public admission in the Cedar Hollow Town Square, captured on video and distributed to approximately 400,000 viewers, by the time Danforth called, constituted something that opposing counsel would find difficult to characterize as anything other than what it plainly was. Margaret listened carefully. She asked several questions, the questions of someone who is not naive about how institutions work and wants to understand precisely what she is being offered before she accepts it. She asked about timelines. She asked about the realistic range of outcomes. She asked what Danforth's conditions were for the pro bono arrangement and what would change if the case became more complex or more expensive than his initial assessment suggested. She had spent 50 years being precise about what she was agreeing to before she agreed to it. On Saturday morning, she called him back. "File it," she said. The next 6 weeks were unlike anything in Margaret's experience of the legal system, which had been limited and largely unpleasant in the instances where it had touched her life. Philip Danforth was efficient and thorough and communicated with her with a directness she appreciated and a respect that she noticed, because its presence was less common than it should have been. Sutton's attorneys, faced with the video and the letters and Winifred Crane's willingness to provide a full deposition, now that the protections she had feared no longer existed, entered negotiations within 2 weeks of the filing. Sutton did not fight it. This was not, Danforth explained, surprising. A man who has just made a public admission of the core facts of a defamation case on camera in front of a crowd to a video that has since been viewed over 500,000 times is not in a strong position from which to mount a vigorous defense. His attorneys were competent professionals who understood their client's position with clarity and were advising him accordingly. The settlement came 6 weeks after filing. Margaret sat in Danforth's Charlottesville office on a Tuesday morning in December and read the settlement agreement with the same careful attention she brought to everything she read, the attention of someone who knows that what is actually agreed to in a document is not always what the surrounding conversation suggests is agreed to, and who has learned to find the specific language that contains the actual commitment. She read it twice. She asked 2 questions, and then she signed it. The amount was not life-changing in the way that certain sums are described as life-changing, the sums that appear in news stories about lottery winners and lawsuit settlements, and carry the implication that the recipient's relationship to reality itself has been fundamentally altered. What it was sufficient. Sufficient to buy a house outright, a modest house, the kind she had always lived in, and found adequate to her actual requirements. Sufficient to live on comfortably for the years she had remaining, without the specific anxiety of a person counting the distance between their income and their expenses and finding the margin uncomfortably small. Sufficient additionally to set something aside for the grandchildren and the great-grandchild who had reached out to her in the weeks since the story broke with a directness and warmth that the older generation had managed with considerably more difficulty. She was not a vindictive woman. She had never wanted to ruin Gerald Sutton in the way that the word ruin is sometimes used as a goal. She had wanted the truth spoken publicly and her name cleared publicly, and the 40 years of consequence acknowledged by the people and institutions that had participated in producing them. These things had happened. The settlement addressed the practical reality that 40 years of unjustly compromised professional and social standing had material consequences that did not disappear simply because the injustice that produced them had been named. She did not feel guilty about accepting the acknowledgement of that reality. She had paid for it in currency that could not be repaid. The house she found was in Cedar Hollow. This surprised her children, all three of whom had assumed in the way people assume things about their parents when they have stopped paying sufficient attention that she would want to leave. That after everything Cedar Hollow had done to her and failed to do for her, the most reasonable response would be to go somewhere else entirely and build whatever remained of her life in a place that did not carry 40 years of complicated history. She had considered it. She was not a sentimental person about geography, did not believe that particular places had claims on people that superseded those people's practical judgment about where to be. She had looked at several options in other towns and found them adequate, and found herself not choosing them. Cedar Hollow was where Cornelia Ashworth had built the basement into the hillside. It was where Thomas had chosen to stay after the wedding no one had attended except the two of them and a distracted justice of the peace. It was where her seamstress shop had stood and where she had spent 50 years making things with her hands for people who had not always deserved the quality of what she gave them. It was where the oak tree in the town square had grown long enough to be old, and where the October light fell in the specific way she had known since she was young. She chose to stay because she had been driven out once by someone else's lie, and she had no intention of being driven out a second time by the residue of it. The house was small, a story and a half, with 2 bedrooms and a garden space, and the kind of south-facing windows that produced excellent natural light for close work throughout the afternoon. She bought it outright in December and moved in before Christmas with the limited possessions that constituted her life, augmented by the things her children had donated that she was willing to accept back, and the things she had acquired in the week since Sunday, because she was no longer managing the specific financial anxiety of a person whose margin has become dangerously thin. She set up her sewing space in the front room where the light was best. On the wall opposite the sewing table, she hung the wedding dress. She had considered this decision for several weeks before making it, turning it over in the specific way she turned over decisions that had symbolic weight she wanted to handle carefully. She could have had it archived, sealed in a preservation case, treated as the historical object it arguably was. She could have put it away somewhere in a chest or a closet, kept but not displayed. She chose to hang it where she would see it every day while she worked, where anyone who came to her shop for alterations or repairs would see it in the clear light from the south windows of the room where she did her best work. Not as a memorial to what had been taken, as evidence of what had been reclaimed. The specific evidence of it, the object that had carried the truth across 40 years in its lining and had been worn in the Cedar Hollow town square on an October morning by a woman who had nothing left to lose and everything left to say. She looked at it sometimes while she was working, in the way you look at things that have a great deal to tell you if you are willing to keep looking. She looked at it and she thought about Cornelia pressing the key into her palm in the hospital room, and about the lavender smell when the basement door opened, and about the sound of the lock releasing after 50 years, and about a young woman who had made this dress in an apartment above a shop with a particular quality of hope that cannot be sustained indefinitely, but that is, while it lasts, one of the most genuine things a person experiences. She thought about that young woman with something that was not quite grief and not quite forgiveness, and was perhaps closest to the specific kind of understanding that only becomes available from a sufficient distance. Christmas came and went with a quietness that suited her. Harrison had come to Cedar Hollow the week before the holiday, and they had sat together in the front room of the new house for 3 hours, the wedding dress on the wall between the windows, and they had talked with the particular quality of two people who have agreed to attempt honesty in a relationship that has been governed for years by its careful avoidance. It was not comfortable. Comfort was not the point, and she did not mistake its absence for failure. It was honest, and that was harder and more valuable than comfortable. And by the end of the 3 hours, something had shifted that had been fixed in one position for years. She could not repair what had been, and she was not trying to. What she was trying to do with Harrison and with Clarice and with Prescott and with the accumulated relationships of a life that had been complicated by someone else's lie for 40 years was to build forward rather than restore backward. The distinction mattered to her. Restoration implied a previous state worth returning to. What she wanted was something new, something that had not existed before, built on the foundation of what had finally been acknowledged and what could now at 75 be brought honestly into the open. She was a seamstress. She understood construction. She understood that you cannot make something new from damaged material by pretending the damage is not there. You acknowledge the damage. You work around it or through it, or sometimes you use it the way a skilled hand uses the irregularities of fabric to create something that could not have been made from perfect material. You build from what you actually have. January came, and with it, the slow return of customers to her shop, cautiously at first, and then with increasing regularity, as the story that Cedar Hollow had been processing since October settled into its permanent form in the town's collective understanding. Some came because they had always brought their work to her and had simply stopped for reasons they were now revising. Some came because the story had made her name known to people in the county who had not previously known it and who needed a seamstress. Some came with the particular hesitation of people who want to say something and are not sure they have the right to say it, and she managed each of these situations with the patience of someone who has had considerable practice with situations that are not comfortable and who has decided that patience is the appropriate instrument. She turned no one away. That was her decision, made before the first customer arrived, and maintained consistently. She was a seamstress. Her work was the work, and she would do it well for anyone who brought it to her, because that was who she had been for 50 years and who she intended to be for however many years remained. February moved through its short weeks and gave way to March. And March began the slow, patient work of turning Virginia back toward warmth, the specific return that Margaret had always found one of the more reliable sources of uncomplicated pleasure in a life that had not always provided pleasure in uncomplicated forms. The garden space behind the new house began to show the first suggestions of possibility, the ground softening, the earliest bulbs sending up their preliminary evidence of what was coming. She was in the garden on an afternoon in late March, on her knees in the soft earth, with her hands doing what hands do when they are involved in the uncomplicated work of planting something in good ground, with the expectation that it will grow. When she heard the front gate, she stood slowly, the negotiation with her knees that such movements required at her age completed, with the patience of long practice, and brushed the dirt from the knees of her trousers, and went around the side of the house to see who had come. Prescott stood at the front gate. He was alone, which was not entirely what she had expected, and then she looked again and understood that he was not entirely alone. He was holding the hand of a small girl, perhaps 7 years old, with her grandmother's eyes, which were also her great-grandmother's eyes, which made them, when Margaret looked into them, the eyes of a face she recognized in the way you recognize your own face in a photograph from before you can remember. Emma Margaret had met twice. Once at a family gathering where Margaret had been peripheral to the proceedings, and once at Christmas when the girl had been primarily occupied with the concerns of a 7-year-old on Christmas morning. She had not had the opportunity to look at her carefully. She looked at her now. "Hi," Prescott said. His voice carried the nervous quality of someone making an attempt they are not certain will be received well, but making it anyway because they have decided the alternative is worse. "I should have called. I wasn't sure you'd pick up." "I would have picked up," Margaret said. He nodded, accepted that. Something in his posture eased slightly. "Emma has been asking about you," he said, "since she saw the news coverage." He looked at his daughter briefly, then back at Margaret. She told me at dinner one night that she thought you were the bravest person she had ever heard of, and that she wanted to learn to sew like you do, and I thought, he stopped, found the next word somewhere. I thought coming here was something I should do a lot sooner than I'm doing it. That's not Emma. That part is me by me. Coming here should have happened a long time ago. Margaret looked at her youngest son, at the 45-year-old face that still carried in certain lights, in certain expressions, the particular quality of the child she had held through the accumulated ordinary moments of a childhood that had been shaped without his full understanding of it at the time by the weight of what someone else had done to the person who loved him most. He was trying. That was what she saw in his face, not the polished performance of trying that she had seen on Harrison's face in the weeks immediately after Sunday, the trying of a man who is aware that he is being observed and wants the observation to reflect well on him. This was the trying of a man who has come alone on a Tuesday afternoon with his daughter's hand in his hand and a nervousness he is not hiding because he has decided that hiding it is no longer worth the cost. "Come in," she said. She held the gate open, and Prescott came through it, and Emma came through it holding his hand, and then Emma released his hand and looked up at Margaret with those eyes that contained their own history and said, "Is that your dress in the window?" Margaret looked down at her. "It is," she said. "Why did you wear it to talk to the bad man?" She considered this question with the seriousness it deserved, which was considerable. "Because it was the most important thing I owned," she said. "And I wanted to be wearing the most important thing I owned when I did the most important thing I had to do." Emma thought about this for a moment with the thorough quality of someone processing information that is new but interesting. "Can you teach me to sew?" she said. Margaret looked at her great-grandchild, looked at the earnest request in a face that had not yet accumulated enough years to have learned the particular protective irony that adults carry over their most genuine desires. She looked at Prescott. He met her eyes with the patience of someone who has decided to wait without managing the outcome, which was its own small form of progress. She looked back at Emma. "Yes," she said, "come inside. I'll show you the dress first, and I'll tell you why I made it, and what happened to it, and what your great-great-grandmother Cornelia did with it, and why those things matter. Then I'll show you how to thread a needle, and we'll start with something small, and we'll work our way up from there." Emma nodded with the full-body commitment of a child agreeing to something she intends to take seriously. They went inside. The afternoon light came through the south windows, the way it always came at this hour, angling across the front room and laying itself along the floor in the particular pattern that Margaret had memorized in the months since she moved in, the light she had chosen this room for the light she worked by every day. It fell across the wedding dress on the wall, the ivory silk taking the late afternoon sun and holding it differently than the surrounding wall, glowing slightly in the way of things that have been made to last and have kept their quality across the years of keeping. Emma stood in front of it for a long time, looking at it with the full attention of a child for whom this particular dress, this particular wall, this particular story was entirely new and entirely real and entirely worth looking at for as long as it needed to be looked at. Prescott stood slightly behind his daughter and looked at the dress, too, with the different quality of someone for whom the story was old and complicated and was being seen today in this room in this light with something approaching the clarity it had always deserved. Margaret went to her sewing table and took out a needle and thread and a small piece of practice fabric, the kind she kept for exactly this purpose, for the teaching of hands that were learning for the first time what hands could do when they were given the right tools and shown the right motions and trusted with the work. She sat down. She looked at the dress, at the light, at the small girl turning away from the wall now and coming toward her with her eyes on the needle and the thread and the particular quality of attention that belongs to someone who is about to learn something that will be with them for the rest of their life. Some things travel across generations by being spoken. Some things travel by being written down and hidden in the lining of a dress sealed in a trunk in a basement against the day they will be needed. And some things travel the way Margaret's grandmother's hands had traveled into her own hands and were traveling now through this October afternoon light into the hands of a 7-year-old girl who had come because she thought her great-grandmother was brave and wanted to learn what brave hands could make. "Here," Margaret said, holding out the needle and the thread. "Watch how I do this first. Then you try on." The light moved across the room the way it always moved at this hour, patient and unhurried, laying itself along the floor and the wall, and the ivory silk of the dress that had carried the truth for 40 years and hung now in the clear afternoon sun of a house that was finally, completely, entirely hers. Outside the window, the first of the spring bulbs she had planted in March were beginning to come up in the garden, their green points pushing through the warming Virginia earth, with the quiet persistence of things that have been in the ground long enough and know without needing to be told that the season for growing has arrived. Rhett stood in it and waited.